Hello, I'm Emma-Louise Coffey and you're welcome to the Dairy Edge, the Teagasc Dairy podcast. We're bringing you the latest information, insights and opinion to improve dairy farm performance. Following the publication of the Heavy Soils Programme report, Pat Tuohy joins us on this week's episode to explain the issues that arise on farms with heavier soils and key practices to overcome these issues.
Drainage is what the major issue, and when we started the Heavy Soils Programme, the key thing was the excess water on these soils and trying to reduce that, and with a view that providing a longer grazing season, longer period for grass growth, and longer period for utilisation and access. So you're talking about a group that represents about 30% of the land area of the country. And the big difference there is late springs, excess water hanging around for longer than you would like or you may like, and as I said, lower production, and poorer access in terms of how those are managed. And with poor drainage, I suppose it can be a characteristic of the soil itself. The soil itself isn't letting the water through. It can be a circumstance in terms of where the land is sitting relative to relief and relative to the surrounding land, I suppose, where it is in the landscape. So the water table might just be high enough that the water is retained in the soil. The soil itself mightn't be necessarily retaining it, but there's kind of I suppose there's nowhere for it to go in terms of relief would be the simplest way of looking at it. And you have other issues then in terms of water finding its way through spring lines and seepage, and water finding its way to the surface, coming from up from below or coming from a wider area that's influencing what goes on in the surface in terms of the drainage capacity of that soil again. So I suppose that's what we keep coming back to is the drainage capacity. But I suppose the more you look at these soils, and there's broader issues in terms of fertility and in terms of the chemistry of these soils and how they react and respond to fertilizer inputs, and how much return is potentially there. That's been a big issue. The more we've looked at these soils, and the more detailed the work has gotten. Excess water isn't the only issue. Getting soils up to appropriate soil fertility levels is a big problem, and managing around that. So it's management then is trying to reduce that volatility, I suppose, and improve the overall picture on these farms.
Another point, Pat, that you mentioned is that 30% of land area in Ireland can be classified as heavy. Is there I guess occasions of heavy soils across the country, or is there certain parts that have predominantly heavy soils?
There's a selection of heavy soils or poorly drained soils in all parts of the country, I suppose, but generally, as you head into so generally as you head west, and as you head into the northeast, the northwest, and down to the southwest, those counties would have higher proportions of poorly drained soils. But there is some in every region, in every county. There's a huge variability in terms of soil types. So you could have some farms in better parts of the country in terms of soil drainage capacity, where 85-90% of the farm will be fine, and like you spoke about, maybe the likes of May that we've just seen will undo the other 10 or 15%. There's other parts of the country then where it could be flipped the other way around, where there might be only 5 or 10% or 15% of the farm that's relatively dry, and the rest is in trouble then in wet conditions. So there and there's huge variability within the farm gate. You can have excellent free draining soils in one part of the farm, and not so much then as you move into different zones or different areas around, depending on the lay of the land, so to speak. So as you head west, it tends to be more the soils tend to be more predominant, but I don't think there's too many parts of the country that are escaping entirely, depending on the soil types and the landscape and the lay of the land. There's a lot of heavy, poorly drained soils out there, in most regions, if not all regions.
And like you mentioned, the Heavy Soils Programme, and there was a report recently released from that particular programme. Is it possible for you to give us some insight into what is involved in the Heavy Soils Programme?
Yeah, so I suppose the background to the program, and it's running the guts of 10 years now, and that's why we recently pulled together that information that was put out in that report, and started off, I suppose, as there was a need highlighted there for a greater level of interaction between us in Moore Park and the farms on these more difficult soils. There was historically, I suppose, a number of research farms, Kilmaley in County Clare, Ballinamore in County Leitrim, Crea and County Mayo that were on those more difficult soils, but those slipped away from the research program over the years. So with a number of wet summers and a number of issues arising out of those, there was a charge, I suppose, level that there wasn't as much interaction as there could be with these types of soils, and as much, I suppose, collaboration with these types of soils in terms of what could be done to improve the outlook for them. So the program was developed on the back of that need, I suppose. It was originally, and still is, I suppose, concentrated in Munster. There's 10 farms on the program, 7 of which are in Munster, and related between the research program in Moore Park, the advisory services in those regions, and the processors in those regions, as well as input from the Crops and Environment program in Wexford and Johnstown. There has been a good bit of collaboration across all those different groups, but the key thing is the processors where there was the co-ops and milk processors where there was a good cohort of poorly drained soils in their catchment. So we had Kerry Agribusiness, Dairygold and Tipperary Co-op in Munster as part of the program, and since those 7 over the years, then there was a farm in Mayo added and a farm in Cavan and Monaghan added, so we're up to 10 now as things stand. So those are, and the idea there is that they're representing, I suppose, a range of different soil types, different climates as you move around the country, and different regions, obviously, where there's, as I said, a good catchment there, where there's a lot of farms in the region with difficult soils, who are having with a view to seeing what they could do with those soils, and I suppose we've benefited then from there's a great relationship there with those 10 farms, and the openness that they've shown has been massive for the program in terms of what they've provided in terms of data, and what they've done in terms of hosting other farms and other events in the area, and there is a benefit there as well in terms of being on farms in the local area that guys locally or people locally can relate to and see what is working and what's not working, and take their lessons from that then, and that these guys are seen as kind of blueprints or flagships or whatever term you want to use in terms of the different changes that are being made, or the investments that are being made in different parts of the farm. So
and I guess, Pat, like from what you say, these 10 farms are located across the country, different soil types, I suppose different locations and associated weather, and also different challenges that they face, based on their circumstance. But I guess if you could summarise some of the main practices that you would have seen these monitor farmers implement over the last 10 years, what would be the big ones?
So the real, I suppose, tell of these farms has been assessing what's going on in terms of the soils. So we've characterised all the soils of these farms, and mapped in terms of, and sampled in terms of what's going on with different soil types. That has been a huge bonus to the program, I suppose, and a lot of work went into that. And I suppose branching off that then has been a deeper dive into the soil fertility question, soil chemistry and soil fertility, the inputs that are going on, what's happening with those, what kind of response rates are we seeing. There has been a good bit of very detailed work done on that in terms of some of the outputs recently. That branches also, as I said, into the land drainage side of things, what drainage system is likely to work, and where it's likely to work, and what parts of the farm are best suited to seeing a return from the drainage investment. also characterizing those soils is, as I said, trying to pick out where to make those investments in grazing infrastructure. So
what are the benefits of, like performance benefits that these farmers have achieved, during the time they've been involved in the program?
yeah, so the farms, I suppose, in 10 years ago were averaging about just under 80 cows per farm. That's increased now up to about 105, which has been fairly steady over the last 4 or 5 years. So um, there hasn't been a massive increase there relative to some other farms or relative to some other regions, but there's still, I suppose, a steady increase there of approximately 25 cows over that time. So in terms of milk solids production, you're maintaining costs all the time. Cost control in these farms is another major issue, and I suppose underpins everything else in terms of the potential for investment and so on. You're averaging about 21-22 cent there over the last few years. And for example, in 2020, the yielded a net margin of 15 cent per litre on that production values, and about, in the last couple of years, between 1,500 and 2,000 euro per hectare of a margin. So they've seen a steady increase in all those figures, and those are as the report that's there is freely available now, so people can look into that in greater detail. But those benefits are clear in terms of the output that's there in terms of production. They've gone from, again, 10 years ago, 8, 9, 10 tons of dry matter production per year up to 12 and a half, 13 and a half over the last 2 years. So there is gains there. There are steady improvements all the time. There's always, I suppose, depending on the farm and depending on the level of development at different stages, there's always different fires to be fought, so to speak, and different things, different demands in terms of where different gains are to be made, or where different challenges are arising. But the general trend is upwards, and has been upwards in terms of those metrics. And it's about, I suppose, keeping that going now for the next number of years, and maintaining those levels, and seeing where the next challenges start to come up, I suppose.
With the Heavy Soils Programme, there was a soil assessment and a map created of the farm, and I suppose an understanding gained of where the drainage systems lie within the farm. For any farmer that's listening today who has, maybe that 10 or 15% heavy soils, or, to the other extreme up to 80-90% heavy soils, looking at considering a drainage project, what is the starting point?
So in terms of drainage, there's a number of different types of systems and scenarios that can be used, and a system that will work very well on one particular soil mightn't do a whole lot of good on another type of soil. So it's about understanding what the soils are, that are being dealt with, where the actual problems are, and what's causing the drainage issue. And it's an expensive business ultimately when it comes down to it, and if when everything is accounted for in terms of contractor costs and material costs. So putting in drainage systems that don't see a return or don't work, I suppose, as effectively as they might do, is it's expensive either way, but makes it very, very expensive if there's no benefit coming with the investment that's made. So I suppose it's to be aware of that, to try and gain an understanding of what the problems are, and how best to approach those drainage problems, then to see a return. And it's often the case where parts of the farm that are performing relatively well in most years, drainage work on those isn't going to see a major bounce in production. It may see a 10% increase or something of that order, but it's not in terms of number of grazings or in terms of grass produce. But the paddocks that really benefit are ones that are on the floor, that are performing very poorly, and the same work done on those, and as I said previously, a bit of time and getting the other elements right can see huge benefits, and that's where the real payback comes. So there's more detail there that's on the Heavy Soils webpage, and there's various different manuals that have gone into the drainage question in a lot of detail, more than we've time to discuss today. But the bottom line is tailoring a drainage system to the particular problem that is in question, and as I said, getting a return then for the investment that's made, which doesn't always happen. If I'm frank about it, there's a lot of drainage work done, and a lot of it, where it's not planned out or mapped out properly, can be very limited in the amount of water that's actually removed, and the actual benefits that would be accruing then as a result.
And looking to that, Pat, are there scenarios where you're looking at a drainage issue and planning out solutions for it? Are there instances where you would say that it's futile and the benefits of completing drainage work doesn't justify the costs of doing so?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, there is a sweet spot there, as I was hinting at, like the paddocks that are performing relatively well. There isn't a huge benefit out of that anyway. The paddocks then that are extremely wet and given the lay of the land and the condition, the relief or the outfall, or somewhere to send the water to is lacking, and there's a whole lot of money to be spent before you even provide an outfall, let alone putting in actual field drains. You can drain any land if you spend enough money. There's no question there, but as I said, once you're getting into very high figures and crazy money, then there isn't going to be a return, and it becomes futile very quick. There is a fairly live issue at the moment, or has been for the last number of years, in terms of the management of organic soils and the draining versus rewetting of those. But before any of that issue is considered, the drainage of organic soils, or of high organic soils, is deep peats and similar soils is very, very difficult to get right in terms of the level of investment required to get the benefits needed to pay for that level of input or that level of investment. So there's those very difficult soils, as I said, with poor outfall, with lots of organics in them, are incredibly difficult drain to begin with. And given the greenhouse gas emissions question and carbon losses, that there's no justification in draining those soils. As well as that, then you have potential for loss of nutrients with those soils is incredibly high, because there is no mineral matter there to hold on to nutrients again. So even if those soils were to be drained, you're putting in you're applying nutrients on those, and applying fertilizers or slurries, and none of that is being retained, or very little of it is being retained relative to mineral soils. So where there's a good cohort of wet mineral soils on a farm, those are the ones that will benefit a lot more than the organic soils, in terms of getting a return for that. So that has to be weighed up, putting drains into certain parts of farms and expecting a result when those drains are fairly limited in terms of extent, or in terms of how much water they're actually collecting, or what they can actually do to change the water table, is generally not that clever in terms of an investment strategy. Whereas paddocks that can be, or parts of the farm that can be drained well, with a well planned out system, as I said, we'll see a return.
And finally, Pat, you mentioned that there are a lot of options in terms of drainage available to farmers. Where can we find more information on it?
So the Heavy Soils Programme has a fairly well updated website. There's links on that website to various different reports that give information on the Heavy Soils Programme and week to week management in terms of production on those farms, in terms of weather on those farms. There's weather stations set up, and links to various different guidebooks and manuals in terms of drainage, which will go through this that issue in much greater detail. So it's www.teagasc.ie/heavy soils, or within the Teagasc website, if you search for the Heavy Soils Programme, that page should be fairly freely available.
That's great. Thank you, Pat.
Okay, thank you very much, Emma-Louise.
That's it for this week's episode of the Dairy Edge podcast, and my thanks to Pat Tuohy for joining me on this week's show. Don't forget to rate, review and subscribe to the podcast. You can listen on Apple and Google Podcasts, as well as Spotify, and for more information go to the Teagasc website at teagasc.ie. I'm Emma-Louise Coffey, and join me next time for your Dairy Edge.